In the last few videos, we have seen some remarkable things in relation to the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus. For instance, Jesus identified himself as Yahweh many times. But when Jesus referred to God in the third person, or prayed to God, what then? How would a Jew have thought about this? How could God be here, visibly and physically, and still be in heaven? In modern times, questions like this plague us. Without context, it makes no sense that Jews could embrace Jesus as Yahweh and not feel as if they were betraying the God of Israel. In fact, these same Jews were willing to die instead of worshiping the gods of the Greeks and the Romans. We could ask certain questions about the readers of the Old Testament prior to the time of Jesus. When ancient Israelites read the passages we looked at in the other videos, did they imagine that Yahweh was localized in only one place? Had he left heaven? Was he no longer omnipresent? The reality is that long before Jesus and the New Testament, careful readers of the Old Testament would not have been troubled by the notion of essentially two Yahwehs, one invisible and in heaven, the other manifest on earth in a variety of visible forms, including that of a man. In some instances, the two Yahweh figures are found together in the same scene. So the concept of the Godhead in the Old Testament has many facets and layers. We've seen so far that the Word was just one expression of visible Yahweh in human form. Now let's explore the Angel of Yahweh. After the birth of his promised son Isaac, Abraham's spiritual journey includes a divine figure that is integral to the Israelite Godhead thinking, the Angel of Yahweh. The most notable passages that hint the angel of the Lord was Yahweh occurred later than the time of Abraham, but there are early hints of his nature during the lifetimes of Abraham and his sons that are often missed. Let's start with the story in Genesis 22, where Abraham was prepared to sacrifice his covenant son Isaac. At this point, Abraham has had several encounters with Yahweh. The expression used to convey the visible, physical nature of those encounters has, at this point, been the word of Yahweh. But Genesis 22 marks a shift in the language for a visible Yahweh figure to the Angel of Yahweh. Now, the Angel of Yahweh appears earlier than Genesis 22 in Genesis 16, 7-11 and Genesis 21, 17. But this particular appearance begins to blur the identities of Yahweh and his angel. Genesis 22, 1-9 relates how Abraham has taken Isaac at the command of Yahweh to Mount Moriah to offer his son as a burnt offering. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son, and the angel of Yahweh called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not stretch out your hand against the boy. Do not do anything to him. For now I know that you are one who fears God, since you have not withheld your son, your only child, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a ram was caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Yahweh will provide, for which reason it is said today, "On the mountain of Yahweh it shall be provided." And the angel of Yahweh called to Abraham a second time from heaven. And he said, "I swear by myself, declares Yahweh, that because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only child, that I will certainly bless you and greatly multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is by the shore of the sea. And your offspring will take possession of the gates of his enemies. All the nations of the earth will be blessed through your offspring because you have listened to my voice." The first thing to notice is that when the angel of Yahweh speaks to Abraham, Abraham recognizes the voice. He does not ask the identity of the speaker as though the voice is unfamiliar, and he doesn't fear that he's talking to the voice of another god. This suggests that he knows who he's talking to. The word translated angel here is the Hebrew word malach, which simply means messenger. The next observation is very important. The angel speaks to Abraham in verse 11 and so is distinguished from God, but immediately after doing so, he commends Abraham for not withholding Isaac from me. There is a switch to the first person which, given that God himself had told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac in Genesis 22, 1-2, seems to require seeing Yahweh as the speaker. Some may say this is the angel being Yahweh's mouthpiece and speaking on the behalf of Yahweh, but that idea is conveyed only later in verse 16 when the angel prefaces his words with declares Yahweh. In verse 11, there is no such clarification. The wording of the text blurs the distinction between Yahweh and the angel by swapping the angel into the role of the person who initially demanded the sacrifice as a test, Yahweh himself. Consequently, the biblical writer had the opportunity to make sure Yahweh and the angel were distinguished, but did not do so. This action of not distinguishing them occurs in several other places in the Old Testament, even more overtly. It's not a failure or careless oversight on the author's end. The wording is designed to blur the two persons together. Genesis 26, 1-5 marks Yahweh's first visible appearance to Isaac. Now there was a famine in the land besides the previous famine in Abraham's time, and Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions." This is a sign to Isaac that the covenant made with his father will be carried on through him. Yahweh repeats the words of the covenant to Isaac in verses 3-4. Later in Genesis 26, verses 23-25, Yahweh appears to Isaac again. Isaac's son Jacob receives the same divine approval in a series of visual encounters with Yahweh. The first instance is the well-known story of Jacob's ladder in Genesis 28, 10-22. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his bed and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it." He was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called the place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and all that you give to me I will give you a tenth." There are several details of the vision that are noteworthy. Jacob is on the way to Haran in verses 1-2, the place from which his ancestor Abraham had departed years earlier at Yahweh's command. Jacob is fleeing the wrath of his brother Esau after stealing the birthright through deception in Genesis 27. It's worth noting that scholars generally agree that the ladder is probably some sort of stair-step structure that, in Jacob's dream, connected heaven and earth, maybe a ziggurat. As a side note, this term is difficult because it only occurs once throughout the Hebrew Bible. We're not certain that this is a ziggurat, but the other option for what this could be is a standing stone. For more to consider into this term, consider the following resources. Moving on, Jacob sees angels of God going up and down the structure, an indication of the presence of the divine council. Jacob also sees the visible Yahweh standing beside him in chapter 28, verse 13, the familiar language for Yahweh in human form we noted with Abraham. In verse 15, Yahweh promises protection for Jacob and pledges to bring the man back to this location, the land promised to Abraham. Jacob names the place Bethel, house of God, in verse 19, and erects a pillar to commemorate his conversation with Yahweh in verses 18 through 19. And Jacob saw the visible Yahweh at Bethel. Given what we've already seen in Genesis, this isn't unusual. Things get more interesting in Genesis 31, the story of how Jacob became wealthy at the expense of his uncle Laban. Jacob's flocks had multiplied supernaturally despite Laban's attempt to cheat him. As the relationship soured, Jacob had a dream, and the wording here is significant. Verse 11 starts, "Then the angel of God said to me in a dream, 'Jacob,' and I said, 'Here I am.' And he said, 'Lift up your eyes and see. All the rams mounting the flock are streaked, speckled, and dappled, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a stone pillar, where you made a vow to me. Now get up, go out from this land, and return to the land of your birth.'" Notice the angel of God explicitly tells Jacob in verse 13 that he was the God of Bethel. Jacob had seen the angels at Bethel and one lone deity, Yahweh, the God of Abraham. This passage fuses the two figures, and this fusion is helpful for parsing Jacob's subsequent divine encounters. It was Yahweh who had promised protection, and to whom Jacob had erected the stone pillar. In Genesis 32, we learn a lot about Jacob's state of mind and God's loyalty to him. In Genesis 32:1, God sends angels to meet him, and it wasn't a dream. Alone that night, he had his most famous encounter with God. Starting in verse 24, "And Jacob remained alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of dawn. And when he saw that he could not prevail against him, he struck his hip socket, so that Jacob's hip socket was sprained as he wrestled with him. Then he said, 'Let me go, for dawn is breaking.' But he answered, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.' Then he said to him, 'What is your name?' And he said, 'Jacob.' And he said, 'Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God, and with men have you prevailed.' Then Jacob asked and said, 'Please tell me your name.' And he said, 'Why do you ask this for my name?' And he blessed him there. Then Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, which means, 'I have seen God face to face, and my life was spared.'" Genesis 32:28 through 29 makes it apparent that the man with whom Jacob wrestled was a divine being. The mysterious combatant himself says, "You have striven with Elohim," a term that we now know can be translated either God or a god. The narrative nowhere says Jacob's encounter was only a vision. The Elohim is tangible and corporeal. And Hosea 12:3 through 4 confirms the divine identity of Jacob's opponent, but then adds two surprising details. Note the way Hosea uses parallelism to express the thought. "In the womb he deceived his brother, and in his manhood he struggled with God. He struggled with the angel and prevailed. He pleaded for his mercy. He met him at Bethel, and there he spoke with him." Not only does Hosea describe Jacob's Elohim opponent as an angel, but the last line of this quotation identifies this angel with Bethel. We know from Genesis 32 that this incident did not occur at Bethel. It was at the waters of Jabbok. Hosea's inspired commentary on the incident isn't about geography. He's telling us that Jacob wrestled with God himself, physically embodied, and identifies God with the angel who said he was the God of Bethel. We've seen this deliberate meshing of God with an angel before. The point is not that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is a mere angel. The reverse is the case. This angel is Yahweh. Yet another passage to consider. Genesis 48 records Jacob's deathbed words of blessing to Joseph's children. The passage references the God who had appeared to him at Bethel, who readers know from Genesis 31 through 13 is called an angel. And it happened that after these things it was said to Joseph, "Behold, your father is ill." And he took his 2 sons with him, Ephraim and Manasseh. And it was told to Jacob, Behold, your son Joseph has come to you. Then Israel strengthened himself, and he sat up in the bed. Then Jacob said to Joseph, El Shaddai appeared to me in Luz, in the land of Canaan, and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful, and make you numerous, and I will make you a company of nations. And I will give this land to your offspring after you as an everlasting possession. And Israel stretched out his right hand, and put it on the head of Ephraim, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who shepherded me all my life unto this day, the angel who redeemed me from all evil, may he bless the boys. The parallel position of Elohim and Malach is unmistakable, since the Bible very clearly teaches that God is eternal and existed before all things, and that angels are created beings. The point of this explicit parallel is not to say that God is an angel. On the other hand, it affirms that this angel is God. But the most striking feature is the verb, may he bless. In Hebrew, the verb bless in this passage is not grammatically plural, which would indicate 2 different persons are being asked to bless the boys. Rather, it is singular, thereby telegraphing a tight fusion of the 2 divine beings on the part of the author. In other words, the writer had a clear opportunity to distinguish the God of Israel from the angel, but instead merges their identities, which we have seen the biblical authors do many times at this point. These patriarchal stories create an astonishing picture for us. If there is only one God, one Yahweh, then why does the writer fuse Yahweh and the angel in some passages, but have the angel refer to God in the 3rd person in others? Why blur the distinction between Yahweh and this angel and yet keep them distinct? What's being communicated? When the Bible does this, it pushes us to wonder whether there are 2 Yahwehs, one invisible in heaven and one visible on earth. And we can see that this is precisely the point. The God of Israel is one God in more than one person.